Hi, welcome to week 4 as we look at socialization in the life course. Hopefully this will be a slightly shorter lecture today as we look at how we are socialized over time. But we are going to start with a theorist, George Herbert Mead, that says something about how we are socialized with this quote: "The I does not appear in the same sense and experience as does the me. The me represents a definite organization of the community. Therein, our own attitudes are calling for a response. This means that as a child or as a person, you've taken on the identification of a community based on how people see me. But when you think about yourself as I am this person, that has a more internalized idea that has been affected by what the community has done to help shape you." So let's talk about aging. We don't really pay attention to knowing ourselves as growing much as a child because we're just going through the process. But as we age and become more cognitive and start to take on the attributes of the community and the family and the system that we're part of, we start to recognize different stages that take part in life. And sociologists love to study the whole concept of, when we talk about people, where are they in the life stage? And how does certain things like your community, your race, ethnicity, your gender affect that stage and how people expect it to be performed. Also, different theorists come at it from different ways. Functionalists will see different stages that are very clearly constructed and expectations of those stages, but often that's shaped by our world in which our economic development is shaped. And so capitalism is going to look at that very different than socialism versus even state-driven communities. And so we have to think about the context and what it says about each one of these stages. So the way we're going to think about today is the 5 major stages of the life course, and then the 3 social concepts of functionalism, conflict, and social interactionism, because they will look at these stages very differently. And there's a lot of times that we don't really recognize that maybe we're being raised in a functionalist way, or maybe conflict is something that we're aware of because of our class or our race or gender. Sometimes different symbols mean different things. And so once again, we're applying theory. Aging as a whole is a combination of biological, psychological, and social processes that affect people as they grow. And so think about how aging has changed since you have come into the world. What's the importance of children and the impact on society? How much money is made off of children? How much money is made off of a student in that life stage? Especially if you go into some sort of upper education. How is that affecting society? What's it mean to retire? What are the things that people do? Why can't certain people retire? What happens if the expectation of retirement isn't an option? All of these things come into play in the aspect of a process, and our aging is shaped very much by the context of the life that we're living. We'll be looking at the 5 major stages of the life course: childhood, teenager, young adult, midlife, middle age, and later life, old age. But we're going to focus a lot on childhood because that's such an important part of where we learn early messages and early ideas are brought into our cognitive thinking, and they're built into the programming of how we do things. And sometimes we're not aware of that until we become a teenager or young adult, or sometimes some folks aren't very aware of it all the way through later life and old age. And so this life course method is actually a theory in itself, that there is a life course that people go across. It's the various transitions and stages people experience during their lives. Those stages are social as well as biological in nature. So think about this. The transition between being 20 and 21 biologically probably doesn't have a huge impact, but what we've done societally to say about that age is that you're more responsible to make decisions, especially about things like alcohol, and there's an expectation of reaching that past 20 goal in the United States. Other parts of the world might have different stages for their young adults to transition. I know some societies where 24, 26 is still considered a young person that isn't fully accepted into the society as an adult, and vice versa. I know societies where a 13-year-old is considered somewhat of a young adult, or at least socially responsible. So that's important for the context of the life courses. Know how the society breaks up when we have social responsibility added to us, whether we can vote or whether or not we are able to drive a car. And then there's also the biological pieces where obviously we're growing. Some of us go through puberty, obviously early stages of development as a child. And then as we age, we start to take on different structure in the body that past a certain time starts to decay. Sociologists have different perspectives on how to approach the study and expectations of our life course. We will look at the three major concepts using this study. As we look at each one of these areas, I want you to think about one, where you still come from. Do you believe there's a clear function for people as they go through each stage? Is that something that is a function for our particular society versus another? Are there conflicts? You know, what determines old age and when a person should retire? What determines whether a person is valued differently based on their age? Does it make sense for the ages we have set? Or is that just something that economically works or is serving particular people? Why is it that we can send people to war and yet they can't purchase alcohol at certain ages? These are things conflict theorists might look at. And symbolic interactionism, it's like, what does this stage of life really say about your symbolism? For example, you know, I'm a Generation X person. My symbols are all built around the late 80s and cool and awesome, and all the different kind of music was kind of, capitalism is a struggle, and we had the Cold War going on. That's different than another generation that may have been raised after September 11th, and the current generation that's going through Trump as president, and the differences in what we're seeing, for example, on gun violence. And so all these things have symbols in our life that kind of determine how we feel about that life stage and what it meant. Again, a short reminder that functionalism then thinks that the perspective is based on a notion that social events can be explained in terms of functions they perform. And so a lot of times when we look at the life course, the early sociological perspectives came out of this camp. And I would say conflict, feminism, symbolic interactionism, ideas about modernism and postmodernism base their argument against functionalism a lot of the time as the conversation partner. But what we're probably going to look at is the idea that we've been taught mostly functional roles. So think about this, the roles that we would call traditional, what you've learned as a child, even if you yourself did not have that experience, there's this ideal type, there's this idea that the norm are, when we see these roles, that they would have a norm applied to them. That's the way functionalists would look at it. But as we know, the role of mother has changed over time as people have seen more women enter the workplace, and we see stay-at-home fathers that choose to raise children. The role of student has changed as people sometimes come back to school, or online student life is very different than campus student life. Or if a student is going through homeschooling. A worker, it's a role, but it's like how many different types of workers do we have? And then finally, you know, ownership and those functional roles that most of these definitions have come out of have changed so drastically that we see these other theories come into play. So conflict theory then would say, you know, why did we create this structure the way we did? Why is young better than old? Older people tend to have more access to resources if they're in particular cohorts. There are certain times where people have been able to establish themselves. There are also a lot of old people that have been devalued, and once they were past a certain working age, aren't able to afford health care, aren't able to be cared for in the same way, or even care for themselves. Why are white populations, seeing often more privilege. We know people that, there are people that are white that have issues as far as poverty, and even sometimes feeling that prejudice from those labels that we put between the groups. But why are those there? Male labor valued more than female labor. This is how conflict theory would look at that. And especially as we raise children in that world, how do we teach about that? Symbolic interactionism, once again, bringing up George Herbert Mead, would emphasize the role of symbols and language as they tell us about ourselves. And why is it, for example, pink is for girls and blue for boys? There's a video that I've shown a lot of times, and I think it's part of the system. If you go into our module, that basically says, we are marketed with color, and it creates two separate markets then. Is it really something to make us distinct, or is it something to make more money for people? Or is it something that, feels good to have different distinctions so that it helps us to figure out what those roles are supposed to be? Or does it confuse us because we don't feel like the way these roles are presented? So symbolic interactionism would ask that. Again, sports cars, why are the young sometimes portrayed, for example, in movies with sports cars, and yet really people a lot of times can't afford them until they reach a certain age, and it feels like a person trying to go through a midlife crisis. All of these kinds of things are built up into that theory. So the first major stage that we often talk about at a level that makes sense to most people is childhood. We talk about childhood a lot because a lot happens, and as a kid, you're not aware that you're being socialized, but later on you take on the traditions and the roles and the norms of your family. And it's not, this role is not the same as babies and toddlers, where you're learning the basics of walking and talking, but it's actually where you start to form ideas, and you start to make those ideas something you interact with in your brain. And that stage between infancy and adolescence is so important because you're trying to take in all this information about what other people are feeding you. What is our community? What is our family? What is our way of doing traditions? Do we have a religion? Do we have a set of family members that are either living with us or not? So that modern concept is children are often seen as mini adults. Childhood is stretched quite a bit, in the past, and not to, I say recent history is within 200 years, and a lot of times even within 100 years, the idea of children and an entire focus of childhood going through educational steps and roles would have not been thought of. They were just often seen as mini adults, expecting to take on the work of the tribe or the work of the community, and pass that on to the next generation. It was the mid-20th century that we started to see development of childhood really start to take place, where socialization was brought to the table as far as a process that we actually looked back and say, hey, children are being socialized in a way that they develop awareness of social norms and values, and we can watch that. We can recognize whether their distinct self is shaped by their parents, by their community. And of course, social reproduction is where society as a whole is trying to set these standards of what that process should look like. And because it's a construct, we do change that over time. So raising girls and boys today may be very different, as those sexes are sometimes enveloped in a culture that is starting to recognize gendering and also how people see themselves and their sexuality. And so parents are taking on different processes of socialization than maybe 50, even 20 years ago. So we have seen this as a new phenomenon as we look at this stage. During childhood, we experience the primary agents of our socialization, which we typically call the family of origin or your nuclear family. And so those agents of socialization are groups where our social contexts are brought into play in a way that we just recognize ourselves as belonging to this. Even if it's not healthy, or even if it doesn't feel like it is something that we would always connect to, it it's an occurrence where we start to identify ourselves within that. Childhood agents of socialization then are our parents, our peer groups, our age grades. You know, we start to see ourselves as a cohort that goes through school together. School, religious groups, sports teams, all of these types of things start to socialize us as a child. That development that was talked about by George Herbert Mead is symbolic in how children develop as social beings by imitating. And I want you to think about the first time you really started to imitate one of your parents or guardians, and what were you doing? What were you trying to do? Were you trying to fit into their clothing? Were you trying to do things like them through play? Like if you saw them mowing the yard, did you try to help out with that? Taking on the role of the other is something that is a very important part of that socialization process. And symbolic interactionists would say we don't necessarily know all the symbols that we're giving off that are becoming real and tangible to young people as they watch and try to emulate what they're seeing. Because that gives identity, and they're searching for that identity because they see it within us. We have an identity within ourselves, those distinctive characteristics of persons or groups, and that are relatable to who that person thinks they are, and that gives meaning to them. And so young people typically, and this is in all cases, there's different levels of learning, there's different levels of ability where that identity gets developed, but no matter what, that person is trying to find meaning, and that's often imitated in a way that we don't recognize as an adult sometimes. As we watch young people, though, we can see them trying to imitate that. And then that personal identity is then different than the social identity, the characteristics that are attributed to the individual by others. So people seeing that child and identifying, oh, they act like this, or they would be a really good person on a baseball team because they can hit the little t-ball, or they start to identify things that the child likes and start to throw that into their personality. So they start to take on a social identity, and sometimes you live into that. It's not something always that's true. There's sometimes as a young child you're seen a certain way, and as you grow into a young adult or a teenager, you might rebel against that. But a lot of times you're fed this idea of who people are expecting you to be. And so in childhood we begin to learn social roles, and those social roles are defined through clear expectations of an individual in a given status and occupying a particular social position. And this is where, once again, functionalists love this. They love the social roles so that they can compare them. And what does that mean to be male, female, child, parent, teacher? So I wanted you to think about some of the social roles you may have learned as a child. Sometimes we don't really think about them until somebody asks us, but what did it mean to be, for example, a girl or boy based on simple definition? What were chores expected to be in the household? Were they equal in your family? Was there a sense of gendering to the chores that you did? What were the expectations that gave you status? Did you see, for example, everyone being treated equally, or was there some sense of status based on what your parents did, or what other friends' houses looked like, or the types of ways in which people talked about your family, or what you noticed? Occupying certain social positions are things that we don't notice until we actually recognize, oh, okay, I may have been part of this social class, or my race and ethnicity actually had some sense of embedded idea in our community about what was expected of me. And so, again, going back to these social roles, functionalists will sometimes say they're helpful in making us feel like we belong, but they're not always helpful in being explained to us. And a lot of times people don't know why we've created them. And so when these social roles are challenged, especially when they don't fit the way in which people are labeled and don't wish to be labeled that way anymore, or never wish to have those labels put upon them, that's when we see these social roles change, adapt, or even break down. And that often happens with the process of self-identity, which is different than social identity. Social identity is so tied up in people placing their wishes and their expectations and desires on you. Self-identity is when you've cognitively started to process who you are, your development, the definition of your style. Maybe it started with the kind of music that you were listening to, maybe the types of activities that you like to do as a kid. And you start to see this type of people that you want to hang out with, and the sense of yourself in relationship to the world around you. So I don't know where you were raised, but I want you to think about that time where you're like, this is particularly who I am. It may not be who my brother or sister is, or my best friend, or a parent, or your family, but it's distinctly and uniquely yours. And where did that come from? How was that something outside of yourself? Symbolic interactionists love this idea that self-identity, functionalists are going to look at this too, but symbolic interactionists give us a good idea of what's going on, is that we start to find symbols that make sense to us, a language that seems to give us a sense of belonging. And the people that we're exposed to, maybe something that, especially in a world that's as digital and online as we are, we're exposed to different types of people, and even the conversations that you put on your discussion groups, you're coming from places where you both find intersection and connectionality, and other times you find a sense of awe and wonder about, wow, your life is different than mine. And we have a venue in which you can talk about that. So self-identity is often developed later in life, and we see a whole generation that maybe didn't really get a chance to really look at that self-identity in the same way that we currently are looking at it. It definitely was going on, but it's moving more into a more pluralistic, diverse expression of that. And it'll be interesting to see over time, as young people develop into their self-identity more and more, what that looks like and how we produce our social roles. This especially is clear with gendering socialization. How children learn their gender roles has changed dramatically. We see TV and media, Disney, all the different kinds of movies like Harry Potter, and just the ways in which the agents and agencies tell us our gender is something we can think in broader perspectives about. And it's not just about our sex anymore. And of course, we're learning more about our bodies, and that there's not these clear categories of biology always even, that we have different gendering presentation that is happening, and that some people present themselves without that label, don't even want to take on that gender. And so there's cisgender, where you feel very similar to who you are. You're like, I'm a girl, I feel like a girl. And then there's sometimes where your gendering is maybe taking on transgender, where you feel like somebody different than what your biological body is. All of these things are new things that we're learning, and it's kind of it shows up in the symbolization of our stories, our TV, our clothing, our toys, and just keeping an awareness of how that changes. And also gives us an idea of this stage, how it will continue to develop over time. Which leads us to the second major stage. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. There's a whole way of looking at teenage life. The second major stage is really pretty new when we think about it. Up until the early 1900s, a lot of times the world of teenagedom was really being a young adult that was working. And that concept of higher education or even mid education, post secondary, all that kind of stuff that we do um, to put stages into life based on the educational track, that wasn't around. There were one room schoolhouses in the United States up to the 1960s and 70s. Um, and a lot of people will contest that after World War II and the introduction of the car being something that a young person could drive, and then as we continue to see small businesses and communities grow, that teenagers could get jobs and at the same time still not have to enter into full adulthood, that we saw this development happen. And of course, the capitalist market took a hold of this idea of teenager and created a whole material culture around it, the music, the way you dress, the activities of life. And that's associated now with puberty and rites of passage that were at one time seen more as rites of passage into adulthood, whereas it's an actual subgroup. And some people would say that that time of adolescence has stretched from 11 years old to 24 based on our brain development. We have noticed that in this major stage that this is where you start to make decisions, not just about who you are as a person, your self-identity, but you're a powerful consumer group. It's a place where conflict theorists will say this whole subcategory of life for our life stage came out of that symbol of creating a culture that was preparing to become the major consumers and the major producers of the world. And the messages of violence and sexual messages and power and all of that is built into this stage where you're trying to both self-identify and at the same time be groomed to be a powerful cohort of optimism, sometimes even, and to continue to perpetuate the society where you're both participants as citizens, but you're a consumer group. And I know that sounds very harsh, but if you really think about it, how are movies and Netflix and I mean, is it really people in their 40s and 50s that consume most music, find new venues for music, or is that something that happens within a particular group? Think about clothing industry and all the different kinds of things that go on with movies and it's often based in the teenage stage and getting you ready to experience that at the fullest. And then the third major stage is young adult, where there's expectation, the functionalists will come back in, that you are going to explore settling in on a job, family or no family, children or no children. Now, at one time, adulthood was all about, of course, you're going to get a job or you're going to get married and you're going to have children. That is not the stage that's not how this stage is expressed as much anymore. The average marriage age for people in the United States is 28 for their first marriage. They may or may not have children, and that identity is often based around your vocation. The stage fluctuates based on extended periods of education, so we're seeing more and more specialization, and with that specialization comes a high level of investment, and that is a just nice way of saying student loans. We're in an unbelievable crisis with student loan debt, not so much for people who actually finish school. We still see a high level of debt there, but the highest level are people that do not finish their undergraduate degree. And so a lot of times this is a time to try to get yourself settled somehow to be established. But what establishment looks like is very different than previous generations where suburbs grew and we saw people get themselves into a stable condition and maybe even plan to stay in a hometown for a long time. No, this is a world where people choose to move several times and maybe choose to have different types of jobs over their lifespan. So young adulthood is a different preparation for adult life. It takes that bridge of adolescence and it moves it into that self-identification, coming into what the expectations of being and surviving in society and the person you want to be, rather than what other people want you to be. Fourth major stage has also changed quite a bit, midlife or middle age, and this is because we see people working longer and we see sometimes people not being able to become established. We obviously don't have everybody working as short of life or expecting to retire at 65. We see a lot more people working longer or never expecting to retire. So that midlife or middle age is often where we start to see people, if they did have children, those children leave home, but they may come back. And it's not this stage where it's like, I'm free, I can make all this money and have that sense of security. No, it definitely is a place where we often see the sandwich generation, where they're still helping young people in their families try to get their foothold, and then we're also seeing them care for elderly that typically live longer. We do see in midlife, a lot of times people have figured out what they're going to do for life as their major vocation. And that tends to define who they are, and they feel more secure in that. That's not always true, but it is more apparent. They start to consider other options in life. This is where in midlife, especially at the later stages of it, before 65, people start to consider, maybe I want to figure out a second career, or go back to school, or go to school for the first time, or choose to get in a relationship or get out of a relationship. These are the kinds of places where they feel more opportunity to actually make those options because they might have a little more experience. And living into old age and planning for it, this is something that planning doesn't necessarily mean that they're taking out a 401k, although some people do, obviously. But what this stage is to really start to see, oh, okay, this is where we're at and what's going to happen next. Am I going to have a chance to retire, or is it something that I have to get used to having a job throughout life? How am I going to stay in this community? And these decisions a lot of times are made in the 40s to 50s. We see a lot more people doing that. Finally, the fifth major stage is later life or old age, and it actually has 3 stages in it because we live so long. And that is a new phenomena as well. We've stretched ourselves out for quite a while. First stage of later life is young old, between 65 and 74. I often give this as my example of this, is that my parents are 83. They live in a community in South Padre Island, and it's actually called Port Isabel. It's the side where most people retire because it's more affordable. And they will often say, oh, the young people moved in next door and they're 65, and that young old is seen as the time where people have more ability or mobility to enjoy life, despite the fact that not everybody can retire at that age. Some people in their young old stage work less, but still keep a job. And some go ahead and take the Social Security benefit and then go ahead and work somewhat into that. It depends on what's going on. But also this stage isn't seen as old. A lot of times this stage is seen as still very active. And one reason for that is the cohort that's entering this is called the baby boomer generation. There are 75 million people in this group. And that's the largest cohort of babies born and that went through high school or through those, stages of 18 to 20 years after World War II. And because it's such a huge cohort, they're not acting the same way or not doing the same things. And so we see the very active young olds, and then we also see a large portion of them that are really struggling, that aren't able to retire and do that American dream. And some of them don't want to retire. That's the last thing, is some people just don't see themselves giving up at 65. They want to work till they're 75. There's a video that talks about that. It's the new idea that's on the module this week. So go ahead and take a look at that, and that'll give you a good idea. I'd love for you to actually talk a little bit about that, and what you think about the life stage and how it is stretching. Old is between 75 and 85, and this is where we see more health conditions. We see a lot of times where people are discovering things about their body, they're readjusting, and then we also see a lot of nursing care start to come into play. There's a lot of times in this stage where the ability to be taken seriously, and this is an honest problem, there's a lot of times where their devaluation based on their ability. They're still a consumer group, but they often are not spending as much except on healthcare and being able to basically survive. So there's a lot of sometimes depression in this stage because the end of life isn't here yet, and there's a lot of adjustment sometimes. As the video will say, we aren't meant to be on vacation for 20 years. Our bodies don't necessarily know how to do that. And so because we're a culture in the United States that values people working, we often see that be a devaluation of this age group because they're so far from the working age. Then there's oldest old, and there we have a lot of people that make it to the century mark anymore, and 85 through the end of life. And although it is a good thing to have a long life, the question is often asked sociologically, what happens? Do we value people in their older age in our society, or do we try to create ways to, put them into facilities? Are families able to take care of them? How culturally? Symbolic interactionism would look at this and say, what's the culture doing symbolically to care for these folks? Is golf the symbol, or is that for young old and old, and oldest old is just waiting to die? Or is there some vitality that can be there? So please watch that video. I think that will be helpful in describing that condition and what's definitely going on. And then finally, in all of the stages of life, we need to pay attention to ageism, where one age isn't trying to discriminate or be prejudiced against a person on the grounds of age. Younger people, saying older people are not worthy, they're just old and they're done, is something to watch out for, and vice versa. If you're a young person and somebody's not taking full care, or they're not being, they're just saying, oh, you're young, and that's not necessarily ageism, but you have to recognize all of us are human in these stages, and there's lots of humanity issues that teach us in these stages to discriminate and be prejudiced against these different groups. And once again, that's kind of a label. The conflict theorists would say it's a label that we put on those stages of life. And I know over 40, we call, aging the aged. The other thing is to keep in mind that as we stretch out this lifespan and as we define it, how much of it is really true? I mean, what's the difference between really a 45 and a 43-year-old? And what's the culturally defined labels that go with that? That's just something to give you thought for your discussion this week. Once again, thanks again for listening to the lecture, and if you need to get a hold of me, my cell phone number is 913-553-0267. Feel free to text or ask any questions. I'll have the discussion up and ready And I hope you have a good week.